Hello everybody, today we are going to be going over the solo lane builds. I'm primarily going to be going over like actual solo lane characters that you would realistically see in most games. I'm not going to include kind of the off meta picks, some like Muriel offlane or something like that, like Iggy offlane. I'm not going to really do that. It's mostly going to be the more tanky characters or characters that are traditionally played in the solo lane. With that being said, I appreciate the support in the previous two videos, and I hope everybody enjoys this one as well. So to start, we're just going to go straight with Crunch. I'm not going to do Countess just because I'm going to do her. I did her in mid, and then I'm also going to do her in jungle. Her build doesn't really change too much. It's the same principles as in mid if you do want to play her, but just going to move on to Crunch and just kind of skip Countess for this. So to start for Crunch, the way you typically start is you go, where is it? Ice Scorn. Ice Scorn is kind of it's your cooldown item. It's an early cooldown item. Very good in the lane. It's very easy to stack. You can also go Witch Stalker if you are against a heavy CC comp and you feel like you might need a cleanse, then you go Witch Stalker. Typically, though, you go Ice Scorn in almost every single game. Then to start, you kind of do need a little bit of a damage item on Crunch, so I go Augmentation most of the time. You can also go Mutilator. Either one is kind of like preference. I think Augmentation is usually more consistent, so I would probably recommend going Augmentation. Then the next item we go typically is Elefrost. This gives you kind of the double procs on the Augmentation as well as Elefrost. You also get your mana back when you use Elefrost, so as long as you're using it correctly, you should have good sustain in the lane. Physical defense, most of the time you're against another physical character. If you're not, you might push this back to third item and then get the third item, which is Tainted Bastion in the slot after. So typically you go something like this. The reason you get Tainted is just because you kind of need anti-heal in most games. If you don't need anti-heal specifically in that game, you can definitely go Crystalline or Unbroken Will, especially if they have heavy CC. You can go either one of these three is fine. Typically I go Bastion just because I just feel like it does you get a lot of value from it, especially into healing comps. But again, if you're not against a super heavy healing comp, just go Crystalline in most games. Occasionally, you can get Unbroken if you're against heavy CC. Maybe you're against like an Argus, Decker, Steel, something like that. Then go Unbroken Will. And then again, if you are into a magical character, you definitely swap the build order of the first and the second and the third item, and get your magical defense first. So that'll typically be what your build looks like for the most part at this point. Then your last two items are kind of situational, whatever you prefer. I typically almost always get a Stonewall, either last or second to last. So this is going to be in pretty much every single build. It's just very, very strong. You can go at fourth, you can go at last. Either one is fine. And then you kind of have a situational slot. Do you want more physical defense? Then you get something like Citadel or potentially Giant's Ring. Either one is fine in this last slot. Alternatively, you could also get another Tainted Guard, especially if you have Bastion already. You get extra value from Tainted Guard since you get the mitigations. So your build might look something a little bit like this, which is also completely acceptable. And then if you want a little bit more damage, you get a Citadel last. So this gives you some prot tread, and then it allows you to kind of chase people down, and you get good protections from it. So that's typically what Crunch would look like in most games. Moving on to Feng Mao. He is probably one of the only full damage characters that you play in solo lane, other than maybe what is his name? Other than Shinbi. There we go. The way you start on Feng Mao is you go Chalice. This is really important. You gotta start the tier 1 Chalice. As for active, you pretty much always go next in every single game. You will always go next. It's just really good value. It gives you extra mobility, really nice. The pen is really nice, and it gives you a lot of burst, especially in the late game. But you almost always start Chalice, and then you can go into Omen in the second slot. Alternatively, you could go into Mutilator. You will buy both of these items either way. Omen's a little bit more of a early game spike. Mutilator gives you a little bit more survivability. If you don't have kill potential in the lane, just go Mutilator. Either one is fine though. Then you come back and you finish the Chalice. You go Mind Razor. This allows you to farm a little bit more frequently, especially jungle camps, specifically if you're invading or something like that. As Feng Mao, you are a hyper-farm character, so you shouldn't really be rotating. You should be trying to farm, invade jungle, things like that. And then third, you have to get your pen option. This is your percent pen item. It's Perforator. The reason you get Perforator over something like Demolisher is just due to the fact that he gives you cooldown. Feng Mao is very good with cooldown. He is a cooldown-oriented character, so you get Perforator. And then you either go Mutilator or Omen, whichever one you didn't get in the second slot, you get in the fourth slot. And then last item, you finish with either an Infernum or a, what's called Tainted Blade. Either one is valid. Tainted Blade's a little bit more like burst. Infernum's a little bit more like overall damage. Tainted is also good if you need anti-heal specifically, or you want a little bit more tankiness, because it does give you a little bit of HP. Maybe you're getting bursted down too quickly in fights. Opt into the Tainted as opposed to the Infernum. Both items are fantastic in the last slot. You can go either or, and you're not going to really get, cooked too hard. Either one is fine, just personal preference or game dependent. Next up, we have Greystone. Greystone's one of the more like tank oriented characters. You definitely kind of want to run at people and be very heavy tank. He goes Sapphire Mantle. The reason you go Sapphire over Razorback is that if you activate Sapphire during your ultimate, you actually get more HP back from your ultimate because it increases your max HP. This allows you to get a lot more value, and you can just kind of snowball a little bit more, and you kind of become a lot harder to kill, especially in the late game when people might just try to focus you before you get your ult off. As for starters, you go Fire Blossom. It's a little bit slow, but once you get that first Brimstone spike, you can actually just start running at people, and you win pretty much every matchup except for maybe Grux in the early game. Once you hit level 6, you start to win it. Same thing with Kwang. Once you're level 6, you can kind of just run at people. As soon as you finish this item, you win every trade against every single character as long as you have ultimate up. And that's kind of how you kind of want to play the characters. You want to have ultimate up. Then we move into, if you need another physical defense item, you go either Elefrost if you want a little bit more damage, or you go Tainted Guard if you are trying to run it like an enemy ADC or something, or you just want to be a little bit more defensive. Either one is fine. I would typically recommend Elefrost as it gives you a little bit more kill potential, but if you do need anti-heal, or you are worried about like a double ADC composition, or they have a Chimera jungle, something like that where you might need some anti-heal, pick up a Tainted Guard. As for the third item, you're going to get some magical defense. Very similar to some of the other characters, you are either going to go Crystalline if you don't need anti-heal. If you want anti-heal, you can get Bastion. If you end up opting into the Tainted Guard, almost always you will get Bastion. If you opt into the Elefrost, you can go either Bastion or Crystalline. Either one is fine, but if you go the Tainted, I would generally recommend Bastion, but you can also go Crystalline and either one will be bad. The difference being Crystalline gives you a little bit of cooldown, whereas Bastion does not. The other difference being Bastion's a little cheaper, so you get your build online a little faster. So it's just personal preference. Either one is fine. And then you pick up a Stonewall in here towards the end. Very similar to Steel, or not Steel, very similar to Crunch. You get a Stonewall in these earlier items. It will be similar to Steel as well later, but you can get either in the 4th or the 5th slot. And then you can also slot in a Citadel if you want a little bit more damage potential. Alternatively, you can also put the Elefrost in one of these slots or Tainted Guard if you end up going the Elefrost in the 2nd slot. It's very flexible. You can kind of do either or. The key thing is that you get Fire Blossom plus a cooldown item, whether that be Elefrost or Tainted, and then you get a magical defense item, whether that's Crystalline or Bastion. Now, if you're into a magical matchup like Steel or Sevarog, you might want to opt into the Crystalline immediately and then swap into the Elefrost. If you are worried about the matchup and you think you're going to get bullied out of lane a little bit, you can do this. You should still be fine even if you don't go magical defense second, but just in case you do find yourself in that type of situation, or you're against something like, an Iggy Offlane or something weird, you would go the Crystalline in the 2nd slot just to be a little bit more defensive oriented in that situation. Moving along, we have Grux as the next character. Grux is kind of a lane bully. You kind of want to pressure the lane. Very similar to Crunch, you're going to go Icecorn. You need this just so you can chase people down. It also gives you good lane pressure. You stack it very fast in the lane due to the fact that it stacks off power. It gives you cooldown. Grux is very valuable with cooldown. His Q and his E, very long cooldown. So having this give you cooldown is really nice, especially since it's kind of hard to get from the tank item since you have to go Basilisk to be kind of a threat in lane. Once you get Basilisk, you can start trading. Typically, you'll get tier 2 off your first back, and then you can set a really hard trade and things like that, and if you use Grux passive. Then the second item you get, depending on the game, you can go Bonesaw, or this isn't here. I think it's in the HP section. You get a Bonesaw in the 2nd slot. Bonesaw allows you to chase people down. You can stick to people, things like that. That's very important. If you are kind of losing or you're worried about getting ganked, Alternatively, you can go the Draconum. This gives you a little bit of defense, some cooldown, things like that. Very good item. The only difference being you lose a little bit of the chase potential due to not having the slow from Bonesaw, which is something that you do have to be aware of. But if you do, just play more around the Ice Scorn and the CC that Grux has to kind of walk people down. After this, you're kind of expected to go full tank. You should not really be looking to be full damage. If you're going any more damage than this, you are going to get punished very easily since you will be very squishy. I typically recommend going something like Tainted Guard, and then you go Bastion, and then you pick up a Stone Wall in the last slot. The reason you go Guard and Bastion is they give you, it basically allows you to get the Bastion mitigation at all times, so you get the 10% mitigations. You also do still need cooldown, which Tainted Guard gives you, and then you get a solid amount of HP from these 3 items at the end. So this is kind of the typical Grux build that I would go in most games. Again, alternatively, you can go Draconum or Bonesaw in the second slot if you really need to. If you're worried about needing double defense, late game you can actually swap this and just pick up like a Unbroken or something like that if they have a lot of magical. And then again, if you are against a magical character, just go Bonesaw, and then you can swap the Bastion into the third slot, and then get double defense at the end physical. So that's Grux. Pretty simple, nothing too crazy. He is pretty easy, and his build is pretty straightforward. Moving on, we have Kwang. Kwang being the newest solo laner in the game. Very, very strong character. Probably the best solo laner in the game at the moment. Typically, when you play Kwang, you go Tempest. The reason you go Tempest over something like Sapphire or Razorback is they don't give cooldown. Kwang is very good with cooldown. Tempest is the only active that you can really start that gives you cooldown. You could go Ice Scorn technically, but you're not a physical character, so you don't benefit from it as much. And then Obelisk is okay, but again, it doesn't give you the cooldown, which is the main benefits to Tempest. And then very similar to some of the other characters, you kind of start Fire Blossom. And the reason you start Fire Blossom is it gives you a lot of kill potential. It procs on the sword throw. So you throw the sword, they get rooted, they take extra damage, and then you knock them up, they're taking even more damage again because they're still CC'd, and then you can trade really effectively with your shield. It gives you a lot of prio in the lane. Very, very strong item. As soon as you kind of get tier 2, you can really start to bully very hard, especially since your 3 gives you such good trading potential. Second item, you're almost always going Flux Matrix, unless you're against heavy physical, in which case you would get Bastion. Either one, you're getting you're going Flux no matter what, whether that's in the third or the second slot. If you do need anti-heal, like you're against a Chimera or something, you would get Tainted in the second slot. But typically you go Flux, and then Tainted's kind of an option. And then third item, you really want to go Elefrost. If you can't go Elefrost because you need anti-heal, then you go something like this where you go the Tainted into the Flux, and then you just don't go Elefrost in your build. Later in the build, you go Stonewall, either 4th or 5th. Very similar to a lot of the other frontliney characters. You are pretty much buying this on everybody. It's just an absolutely insane item. It gives you mitigations. It gives you a stun. It has great protection, 70 prots plus HP. Very good. Insane item in the late game. Very, very strong. Alternatively, you also could get another magical defense item in the late game. Where is it? Magical. Again, you can also get a Bastion if you end up going Tainted. You can go Bastion in one of these slots. If you don't go Tainted, I would probably recommend going something like Unbroken. You really don't need a lot of damage on Kwang to actually kill people, but if you want to, you could end up going Flux, and then in the third slot, you just go a Tainted Blade, Tainted Scepter. Instead. So this is something that like you'll see me do a lot, especially in videos and things like this, where I'm kind of ahead and then I really want to keep pushing the lead. I'll get a Tainted Scepter in one of these slots instead, and then you finish the same way, whether that be Stonewall or Broken or a Crystalline in here instead, and you get some Stonewall plus a +1, basically. You get Stonewall +1, whether you need physical or magical. It depends on the game. But this is typically how you can build if you want a little bit more damage. I would not recommend going other damage items just due to the fact that they don't give HP. You could go Worldbreaker, but I typically haven't had good success with Worldbreaker, especially since it doesn't give you cooldown, whereas Tainted Scepter gives you the cooldown, which is really important. It also gives you true damage, which means you're guaranteed to get value off of your abilities, and gives you a little bit more kill potential, as does something like Tainted or Elefrost, either way. Typically, the way you kill people is just with your CC and your ability to spam your abilities due to the fact that you have a lot of cooldown. So that's typically why you don't have to build a lot more damage than you might think. The next character on our list is going to be Riktor. Riktor's very simple. You go Razorback in most games. You can go Sapphire Mantle, but I would typically recommend Razorback since you're going to be hit. You're a big target. You kind of want to just walk at the MEADC or kind of eat abilities sitting up in the front line. And then very similar to Kwang, you go basically the same build. The only difference being you don't get Tainted Scepter and you don't get Elefrost. You pretty much just go something like this, where you get Fire Blossom into Flux, or you go Fire Blossom into Tainted. Either one is fine. Whichever one you don't get second, you're going to get third. Because you're such a big body, it's very easy for ADCs to kill you, so Tainted Guard gets a lot of extra value. And then last item, instead of the Unbroken, if you don't need it, you go the Crystalline, the Bastion. The reason you get Bastion is because you already have Tainted, so you get double mitigation, basically at all times from Bastion, since if you get auto-attacked, you're still applying the anti-heal. This makes you very tanky, and it is very strong. You can go the Bastion in the 4th slot instead of the Stonewall. It's situational. If you need the physical earlier, then you get the Stonewall in the 4th slot. If you don't, then you get the Bastion. That's pretty much it. Nothing too crazy about Riktor. He's very simple. Not really a lot of counter building. You kind of just do the only difference is whether or not you go Flux second or third. Either one is fine. But it's just preference, and depending on the game, whether or not you need the anti-heal or not. Moving on, we have Serath. Serath's the next character. Serath is probably a surprise to some people. She's very strong in the solo lane. Can get a lot of value specifically against characters like Steel, Sevarog, kind of the lower pressure picks. She's actually a counter pick to Steel due to the fact that you can dash his dash, which allows you to kind of just win the lane, and then if he ever dashes on you, you can just ult and run him down. That's typically how that matchup goes. She's very good into those specific matchups. I probably would not recommend playing her into like Grux or Greystone. Those are kind of like two not good matchups for her, but she is actually pretty strong in the solo lane. And there's 2 starter items that you can go on her. One being Sapphire, one being Icecorn. I think Icecorn's typically a little bit more value, but if you do need to be more of a frontliney character, maybe you have a Kalari jungler or something like that, then you would pick up the Sapphire Mantle. The alternative to why you would pick up Sapphire is if you're against a heavy trade lane, and you need the extra sustain in the lane that Icecorn does not give you on the tier 1 and tier 2. And then your build is pretty straightforward. You go Overlord. This gives you clear, then power, which you kind of need. And then second and third, you end up getting the Basilisk and the Bonesaw. Either one, typically you go Basilisk because you need the cooldown, especially if you go Sapphire. But if you go Icecorn, you can kind of go either or. I would typically recommend the Basilisk in the 2nd slot. Third item, you go Bonesaw most of the time. Occasionally, you can go Tainted Blade if you need anti-heal, but I would recommend Bonesaw in most games. You just kind of need the HP, and it gives you a lot more power since you have Overlord. Last 2 items, you end up picking up a Stonewall. You just need it. You're a dive character. You need the stun. You aren't super tanky. You just have a lot of HP, which makes you tanky. So you do actually need some protections, which is why you have to get the Stonewall at some point. And then last item, you get a magical defense item. Typically, you get Unbroken. If you need it, or Crystalline, either one is a fine option. Alternatively, if you want to do a little bit more damage, maybe you feel like you're ahead and you kind of get to this point and you're really like snowballing and stuff like that, then if you want a little bit more of a damage-oriented item, you can pick up the Tectonic Mallet in the last slot. This is pretty good. It gives you power based off your movement speed. Your ult gives you movement speed, which allows you to get a lot of value off of this. And it also gives you some cooldown. Another item to go if you are snowballing is you can also get a Citadel instead of the Stonewall. This kind of stacks with the Basilisk. I would be careful doing this. The only thing that I would be worried about is the fact that you don't get the Stonewall stun. If I do go Citadel, typically I end up cutting Bonesaw and go something like this, where I go Citadel third, and then I end up getting Mallet late game. The Citadel kind of makes up for the lack of HP that Mallet has, but then you still also get the Prot Shred, so you could do something along the lines of this. You can also even move the Mallet up 1 if you really want to. So that's typically how I would build Serath, and how my solo laner builds Serath and things like that. And his recommendation on what you should be building and what I have seen work and what I have made work myself. Moving along, we have Sevarog. Sevarog is a Razorback character. You are I'm going to walk at the ADC. I'm a big body. I'm going to take shots. I'm going to do damage. That is a Sevarog playstyle. You start with a Fire Blossom always. It just gives you the lane clear. It gives you the lane pressure. You can't really get traded when you have this. You do have to be careful because you are Sevarog early game, but is a very strong item. The next item you go is either Tainted Guard or Elefrost if you need another physical defense item. Alternatively, if you need magical defense, you could get a Flux Matrix in the second slot. You can also get a Crystalline or a Bastion. Again, very common. There's not too many crazy items in the game, so you're going to see a lot of builds having similar items. If you go Tainted Guard in the second slot, you get Bastion third, and then you can get a Flux later if you need it. Alternatively, you can get the Flux third and then get the Bastion later if you want to, and then you finish with a Stonewall in either the fourth or the fifth slot. This is typically how most Sevarog builds will look. Again, you can go Tainted, you can go Elefrost, just some combination of these items. Usually, if you go one Tainted, you're going to get both. If you don't, then you're going to get the Elefrost and the Crystalline in most games. If you really need the magical defense, you could swap the Flux to late, but I tend to like the cooldown from Flux a lot, especially since Fire Blossom does not give you any, which is one of the biggest downsides to the item. So usually I like to have Elefrost or Flux in the second slot, in which case my build might look something like this, and then you end up getting a magical defense item last like this. So this will typically be how my builds look. If you are against heavy physicals, you can also look at like a Warden's Faith or something like that, but they're way more situational, and I would not recommend them in most games. Even just getting something like a Tainted Guard late in the game would also be completely acceptable if your job is to just kill the enemy ADC, which as Sevarog it should be. Moving along to Shinbi. Shinbi is played a lot more consistently than something like Countess, which is why I'm going to cover her. Her build's very similar to her mid build. Typically, you go magical power, you go obelisk. Your job is to just scale. That's pretty much it. You scale with obelisk and then you split push, and you kind of become like a demon in the split push, and that's pretty much your job. You don't really do anything else. Her build is very similar to mid. Again, you are going to get a Mega Cosm at some point. You will get a Caustica and an Oblivion Crown at some point in your build. If you watch the mid video, kind of talked about why you need to get these 3 items at some point. Should be specifically, you get an Oathkeeper. This would typically be what my build looks like. The 5th slot really does not matter that much. You could go Spirit of Amir. It's completely fine. You can also push all of these items over and get Spirit of Amir in the 1st slot if you feel like you kind of get like a weird back or something like that. Maybe you traded a little too heavily or something and you can only back on 350. You can go something like this. Typically, that's how my builds would look like if I played Shinbi in solo lane. So if you're playing her, this is what you're going to go. If you want more like in-depth detail, check out the mid video where I talk a little bit more about why you build specific items or why they are strong. Going to Steel. Steel is pretty much the exact same as Riktor. You're going to go Razorback. You want to walk at people similar to Sevarog, but you are just a CC bot. I mean, that's kind of your job. You are going to go Fire Blossom. Very, very strong item. And then again, very similar to some of these other characters, you are getting a Stonewall in your 4th or 5th slot. Your second item is almost always Elefrost if you can afford to go it. Elefrost is very, very strong on Steel. He has good CC and lockdown, so getting Elefrost procs consistently is very easy, and he has very low cooldowns on like his right click and things like that, which allow you to actually get an insane amount of kill potential on enemy players. Flux, very good Steel item, gives him a lot of cooldown. He benefits a lot from cooldown. And then I typically go Flux over Crystalline. If I do feel like I need double magical defense, I tend to lean more towards Bastion since you already have 2 very heavy defense items. Alternatively, I tend to lean towards Unbroken because if I'm dying to magical, I'm probably getting CC'd a lot of the time, especially if I'm against like a Argus or something like that. So this will typically be how my build looks, and then you also still have the double Tainted flex. If you do need double Tainted, I would say cut the Elefrost and just get the Tainted, and then get the Bastion in the late game. The one thing that kind of sucks about this is that you lose the Elefrost. You can also cut the Flux and put the Elefrost in there if you want. It does give you good kill potential, but again, you do lose the Flux cooldown, which kind of sucks. Elefrost has some, so it makes up for it. You just have to make sure that you don't need double magical defense. But if you're against a physical heavy comp or like their ADC is snowballing, you can definitely do something like this where you kind of put the Bastion in here as your single magical defense item, and then you end up getting Elefrost and Stonewall anyways. Whether that be in the 3rd, 4th, 5th slot, all 3 of these are kind of interchangeable depending on the course of the game. And then moving on, we have the last solo laner, which is Zarus. Pretty strong right now. Kind of has a flexible build. There's a lot of stuff you can go. I'm only going to give you one build. I would give you a couple options, but for the most part, you almost always go Icecorn in like a real game. Alternatively, if you think you can snowball the lane or you're against a weak pick or you want to try to 1v5, You can go Ortis and just try to stack with your ultimate and scale really heavily. You will be a little bit squishier, but either one is fine. I would say typically I would recommend Icecorn to people that are trying to learn the character and things like that. But if you do get a little bit more comfortable and you're not too scared to trade in the lane, Ortis can be very strong. First item you're going to get is either Augmentation or Mutilator. It is personal preference. Augmentation is probably a little bit more consistent, very similar to Crunch, but Mutilator is completely valid as well. Second item you are going to get is Elefrost. Elefrost is very, very good. As you've seen in some of these other builds, it is very relevant and people buy it a lot. Elefrost, very good item. You don't really need a lot of like crazy anti-heal in Zarus since you already have a lot of burst anyways. And when you go Augmentation plus Elefrost, very similar to Crunch, you have a lot of auto attack potential when you hit somebody with a combo. Second item you're going to get after Augmentation is going to be a magical defense item of some type. Usually you are going to get a Crystalline in most games. You don't really benefit from Flux, and the only other real option is Bastion. You might go Bastion if you need anti-heal, but for the most part you don't. I would really only buy it against like Rampage, which does work because his rock is actually magical, so if he rocks you, it will still proc Bastion. Alternatively, if you're against like a Countess or something like that, Bastion could be very good. Crystalline is just kind of like the default item. If you're not sure what magical defense item to get, just get Crystalline. You can also get a Unbroken if you're against like a Steel or something like that. The fourth item you are going to get is typically a Tainted Blade. Tainted Blade, very good. It applies anti-heal as well if you're against like a Chimera specifically. This is very good. It allows you to do a little bit more extra damage when you hit people, and then when you apply anti-heal, it is very strong. That's why typically I end up going Bastion in most of my builds, just because I go Bastion plus Tainted Blade. So if they're not getting anti-healed by Bastion, I'll anti-heal them with Tainted Blade, and then I'm still very tanky because I'm getting the 10% mitigation. And then last item, you finish with the Stonewall, traditionally like most characters. Alternatively, if you want a little bit more of a damage-oriented build, if you're very like snowballing and things like that, you can get a Citadel. You can also swap the Tainted Blade for a Citadel, as well as something like this. So you end up going like a Crystalline into a Citadel into a Stonewall. Typically, I only go the Tainted Blade if I feel like I can get away with it. Otherwise, I'm kind of more of a frontliney tank character, where you go like Icecorn and then you go something like this. You still have a lot of damage potential due to Citadel and Augmentation and Elefrost, but it's not nearly like you're one-shotting. But if you do get some stacks from your ultimate, you can definitely one-shot some people occasionally. But that's it for the solo video. I appreciate everybody watching. Hopefully maybe you learned something, or you have any questions, feel free to ask me either here on YouTube in the comments, on Discord, or on Twitch. I appreciate everybody watching, and I hope everybody has a good rest of their afternoon.